Lydia Brooks, a quiet cleaning staffer, discovers a braille letter in the CEO's boardroom and reads a single haunting line. Observed by Evan Carter, a CEO paralyzed by grief after his blind wife's death, Lydia's reverent act triggers suspicion from Evan's assistant, Harper, who engineers Lydia's suspension to hide her own theft. Evan exposes Harper, asks Lydia to read his wife's final letter for him, and through that reading, he finally grieves and changes his priorities. Lydia is offered leadership in an accessibility initiative. Invisibility becomes purpose. Rain stitched thin lines down the floor-to-ceiling glass of Carter Holdings as the city slept. The boardroom lights were dim. The leather chairs were arranged with surgical precision. A clock on the far wall said 5:47 a.m., digits humming the promise of a day already scheduled. Lydia Brooks moved like a small, steady-tide cleaning cart, rag, spray bottle, her footsteps soft against marble, the wheels whispering a pattern she had learned by memory. She did not expect to stop. Clean, move on. Be invisible. That had been the pact she and her mother made when the world began to blur at 45 and their apartment darkened with the loss of sight. Lydia's hands were her compass. They learned the world by touch, the way other people learned by sight. Her apartment was a map of raised dots and soft edges, a wooden plaque in braille above her bed, a chipped mug with a thumbprint by the handle, a single photograph with the face smudged into memory. "Your hands can see what eyes cannot, darling," her mother had said, and Lydia carried the sentence like a talisman. On the CEO's desk, a single sheet lay, ivory and sober. At first it read like a mistake, raised dots caught in the dim light, a secret embossed only for fingers to read. Lydia's throat tightened. Her hand hovered. Somewhere in the hallway, the building breathed elevators, distant HVAC, indifferent mechanisms of corporate life. She could have walked past. She almost did. Instead, her fingers descended with the gentleness of someone reading a prayer. The dots were small constellations under her touch. The message was brief and wrong and true. When you stop feeling, you stop living. The words settled into her chest like a hand. She did not know whose voice had formed them, but she recognized the shape of grief in the cadence. It was an old, honest ache. A shadow shifted beyond the glass. Evan Carter watched from the doorway of his private office, a figure framed by city light and the edge of an inheritance he could not unmake. His face was a study in careful lines, jaw set, shoulders a trained fortress. He had learned to watch instead of touching, to measure instead of feel. To survive, he had become efficient. But the sight of a stranger treating a private grief like a relic, fingers reverent, replaced paper exactly, moved something he had thought sealed. He didn't step forward. He only watched, his presence the static between notes. Lydia replaced the sheet as if she had placed down a sleeping child. The spray bottle felt heavier in her hand, the ritual complete. She left no fingerprints out of habit and respect, a cleaner's discipline, a daughter's tenderness. Mr. Dennis at the security desk watched her glide past later with a thermos cupped between warm hands. "Morning, Lydia," he said, the way someone seeing a plant heated its fragile green. She smiled. Small. Contained. Invisible mostly. But the glass kept a record. A camera blinked. A man with a suit had seen. Somewhere beneath the clean surfaces of Carter Holdings a small story began to unfurl, a thread connecting a girl who learned Braille at her mother's bedside with a man who had stopped reading the letters he'd been given. Outside, the rain continued its soft, patient erasure of footprints. Inside, something had been noticed. The morning moved like clockwork. Executives arrived in rows of tailored coats. The lobby smelled faintly of espresso and polished leather. Lydia practiced invisibility the way some practice prayer, precise, silent, unobtrusive. She knew where to stand, where not to linger. She knew the sound of Mr. Dennis's cup against the saucer, and the particular way the elevator hummed when it carried someone important. The world rewarded the people who fit their roles. But some roles were porous. Today, a mistake in a folder slid a key into a lock no one expected. Lydia had been at conference room B to clean when a misprinted stack sparked irritation. Harper Lynn, Evan's assistant, organized everything like a battlement. Sharp blazer. Sharper mouth. She noticed habits the way some people noticed fossil lines for leverage. When Mr. Chin, the delegation's visually impaired partner, tapped his cane and reached for materials. The discovery that some pages were not in Braille created a taste for swift correction. Lydia heard the clatter before she saw the crowd. Hushed whispers, the rustle of paper. She had been in the hallway when the call went up. Mr. Chin needs the Braille copies. Something in her chest tilted. She stepped forward, cart to one side, voice small and steady. I can read them. Laughter rolled from Harper like a cold breeze. A cleaner? The room's gaze slid over her, landing on her hands like a verdict. Mr. Chen's smile was an innocent flashlight. Let her try, Evan said quietly, and something in Lydia recognized the same gentleness she had felt at her mother's bedside. Permission. She read like she had been taught to pray rhythm, patience, and unornamented truth. The financial terms became a texture under her fingertips and a language in her voice. The room stilled not because her words were pretty, but because the authenticity of that voice reframed the people under the light. Mr. Chen's face brightened. The senior men shifted. The ledger of assumptions had been altered by a simple capability no one had waited for. Harper's eyes narrowed. A tidy mind can't abide surprises that threaten the hierarchy it polices. She logged every presence on the executive floor with a ledger in her head, and Lydia's lingering had no place on it. That night, she sat with her tablet and scrolled footage, connecting dots until a plausible story formed. Cleaner too close to CEO's desk, unauthorized access to materials, possible breach. It had the sheen of plausibility and the moral clarity of scapegoating. Meanwhile, Lydia returned home to the small apartment that smelled faintly of lemon oil and old paper. Her mother's plaque, the wooden board with raised letters, was an altar. She pressed her fingertips into it and felt the familiar words like a compass. I see you even when I can't. The plaque was the secret ledger of her life. She had carved meaning out of the places the world had chosen to ignore. Teaching Braille, reading for strangers, the small kindnesses, they were stitches. Tension mounted like the building's elevators. For Lydia, the stakes were not corporate balance sheets, but dignity and livelihood. For Harper, the stakes were control and career. For Evan, a quiet curiosity had become a fissure. A cleaner's courage had reminded him of a man who once learned to look with hands and heart because his wife had taught him. Unseen histories bled into the light of morning. A test once set can either prove integrity or become a trap. Harper began to write the trap that would reveal not Lydia's malice, but someone else's fear. Harper liked the litany of reasons she could recite to justify caution, security protocols, confidentiality, corporate liability. In the gray world of mergers and meetings, such rules were protective seals, but they could also be knives. She organized a narrative with the precise arrogance of someone who'd spent her life anticipating breaches. A cleaner scene at the CEO's desk, a tidy, telltale sign. Lydia's gestures were small and innocent, but in Harper's ledger they glittered as opportunistic. Evan, however, kept being pulled by two currents. The first was professional, risk, optics, precedent. The second was private and ugly, a man who had memorized grief like a map written in Braille. He reviewed footage because it had been suggested, not because he sought evidence. What he watched unsettled him. Lydia's fingers on the paper were the hands of someone saying a silent prayer. She smoothed the page, set it back. There was no theft, no furtive transmission of files, nothing to criminally prosecute. Yet Harper's narrative was already in motion. They staged the bait as theater. Evan and Harper discussed it like technicians. Leave an urgent-looking, Braille-labeled document in the boardroom tonight. Watch who approaches it. Build the timeline. The trap was made by a woman who thought she could fix everything with order. But plans encounter truth in unexpected ways. Lydia pushed her cart that evening into the echoing boardroom. The paper at the center table looked official. Thick stock, an embossed header, Braille dots arranged like a small map. Under the lights it seemed like a test not meant for her. Her rag slowed. Her fingers hovered twice, then touched. For a second, the ritual of reading felt like trespass. This is private, she whispered to the air and placed the page exactly where it had been. She left. Watching through grainy monitors, Harper declared victory. She'd established intent to access sensitive pages. Yet when Evan replayed the footage slowly, something in him loosened. Lydia had approached, read 3 words, then recoiled. She had not pocketed, photographed, or passed information. She had treated the sheet like a small, fragile thing. A line of moral clarity separated her action from maliciousness. But the story Harper had been building needed a sound, a conclusion. She yoked small irregularities, a cart near an executive hallway, times her badge had been in unusual places, into cumulative proof. Human memory is fallible, pattern recognition is easier to weaponize than accurate scrutiny. Within days, Lydia stood in a small HR office facing a sterile folder and Harper's thinly triumphant smile. "Miss Brooks," Harper said, "we've received concerns about your conduct. You're suspended pending investigation." The word landed like a physical blow. Lydia's cheeks burned not with anger but with shame. She had not done anything to hide. Her life had been small economies, a shift's wages, a mother's medications, a single bus pass. The corporate machine measured value in degrees and lines on a CV, and in that calculus her life was considered expendable. Mr. Dennis found her in the lobby as she gathered her card on the way out, his face a map of lines he'd traced long enough to know what people's smallness and their depths were. He offered a thermos, a hand on the shoulder, a confidence she had never earned anywhere else. "You belong," he said. Words didn't change policy, but they mended something else. While Lydia's world constricted, Evan's perception of events splintered. Something about Harper's zeal felt performative, a cautionary instinct, trained by a life in crisis, nudged him toward doubt. He asked for Harper's access logs for the past months and found irregularities, unauthorized entries, files photographed and transmitted. The neat trap Harper had set upon Lydia began to look up at its maker. Evan's office at night smelled like lemon oil and a life of enforced order. He watched Harper's footage on his screen and found there the candor of exposure, her hands rifling through drawers, her phone camera clicking, moments of quiet theft stained by audacity. The ledger Harper intended to build for Lydia's downfall had become a mirror that reflected her own culpability. He felt something that had nothing to do with litigation, shame, small as an ember. He'd been trained to see character. His wife had taught him that. Now the lesson was returning to him with a strange insistence. He called Harper in at 7, the city outside forming a ring of distant lights. The confrontation was surgical and cold. Harper began with the same rehearsed warmth she used to marshal meetings. Her voice faltered only when Evan turned his monitor to show the footage. Denial came first, then rationalization, then a collapse that was peculiarly human: fear. She had reasons, pressure, ambition, debt, explanations that made her less monstrous and more tragically ordinary. Evan listened, the distance between professional duty and humane reaction collapsing in the space of his attention. "You built a case against an innocent woman to distract from your actions," he said. "You weaponized sympathy." He terminated her, a move public enough to resent and private enough to scar. Word traveled in the building the way rumors do, quickly, with partial truths. Lydia was reinstated, compensation followed, an apology was issued in clipped corporate language. But the moment of public vindication did not erase the humiliation. The night Lydia spent clinging to the plaque on her wall reading the same raised sentence she had read 1,000 times: "I see you even when I can't." She pressed her fingertips into the wood until her knuckles ached and wondered whether visibility was a gift or a burden. The world had noticed, yes, but only because someone else had tried to manipulate that attention. Evan, however, carried another unread burden: a packet of letters in a locked drawer, 17 envelopes in Braille, written by Natalie in the slow months after the accident and during the sickness. He had read 16 and could not open the 17th. Each letter was a map of their married life after sight left them, each held small, careful sentences meant to console a man who would later become his own jailer. Lydia's accidental brush with the first letter circulated on monitors. Suddenly the last one felt like an accusation he could not meet alone. He found Lydia cleaning the basement storage room early the next morning, suspended but working because motion kept her mind from looping. She startled as he called her name. He told her Harper was terminated, that she was reinstated, and he gave her the apology that corporate policy could not craft: sincerity. When he asked her to read Natalie's final letter for him, his voice had the brittle pleading of someone unlearned in asking for help. Lydia's breath hitched. A stranger's silence had ached for months in his chest. Could she give words to grief he could not say aloud? They sat in Evan's office after hours, the city a muted constellation. Lydia eased the thin envelope into her hands as if receiving a relic. Her fingers trembled as they aligned the raised dots. She began to read. The room folded into each syllable. Lines that once lived as private bones now found air. Evan's shoulders loosened only as she continued, words stripping layers of armor like old paint. The reading did not alter the past. But it did something else. It offered a ritual of release. Grief, held alone, calcifies. Grief shared becomes movable. Evan's body, practiced in restraint, finally surrendered to a trembling the size of honesty. Lydia's voice, honest and clear, served as conductor and conduit. The building, with its glass and marble, felt suddenly smaller and softer, as if a curtain had been drawn back on a stage where two people had been pretending to perform separate, lonely roles. The words in that last letter were concision and mercy. Natalie's handwriting, translated into ordered bumps beneath Lydia's fingertips, asked for something Evan had never been able to grant himself: permission to let the past be what it was, and to let the future be what it might become. If you ever feel cold, Natalie had written, remember kindness is the light that never leaves you. The sentence landed like a lantern. Evan's composure ruptured without ceremony. He let himself weep the way someone unclenches a fist, long, ragged, unedited sobs that came from a place kept tidy and closed for too long. He covered his face with both hands, shoulders heaving. Lydia, small and steady, kept reading, her voice sometimes hitching, but always clear, like a tide pulling grief from rocks. The words were not cathartic in a tidy, cinematic way. They were granular and honest, small truths laid bare. As she read on, the air in the office shifted. Firmness dissolved into something porous and human. When the last line left her lips, silence filled the space like an answer. Evan's hands were wet. He looked older, not because of time, but because sorrow had done its work and left him raw. He reached for Lydia's hand before he meant to. It was a human reaching, awkward, unguarded. Her palm was warmer than she expected. The gesture had no melodrama, only an honest inclination toward another person who had helped him carry a weight he could not shoulder alone. I couldn't, he said, voice cracked. I couldn't read the last one. I felt if I did, I would be saying goodbye for real. The confession was small but seismic. Lydia pressed her thumb against his knuckles as if to anchor him in the present. You were already saying goodbye when she wrote it, she offered softly. But she wasn't finished with you. He listened, and for the first time since the letters had been sealed, there was room for tenderness between them. Evan's grief did not vanish. Sorrow does not dissolve in a sequence. But a fissure of possibility opened. What had been an immutable, fossilized regret could be reshaped into purposeful action. A simple letter, private, tactile, true, had restored a map to a man who had stopped trusting maps. He stood then, the architecture of the man reassembling around a less rigid center. We should do something, he told Lydia, not as a planned PR move, but as an instinctive reach toward meaning. Not just a plaque. Not just a memo. Something that changes how we see, literally and figuratively. Lydia's chest fluttered, not with career ambition, but with the knowledge that commonplace acts could have uncommon consequences. They planned late into the night, two people who had shared grief and a new resolve. If Natalie's words asked him to be the hand that guides, then the company's resources could be a lamp for others. Lydia sat across from him in the warm pool of the office light, and they drafted the rough bones of what would become accessibility for all. Braille training, hiring pipelines, community outreach. The idea was practical and tender, bureaucratic and humane, which made it oddly impossible and urgently necessary. At the center of the plan, Lydia was not a token. Evan insisted she co-design the program, not to sanitize guilt, but because she possessed the knowledge the executives lacked. She had been invisible most of her life. Now she had authority to convert that invisibility into structure. It was not restitution he could pay, but a platform she could use to change lives, perhaps even the life she'd always imagined in small, private ways. The community center windows swallowed Seattle's gray and returned it as a warm wash of color inside, sunflower yellows, gentle blues, a mural of hands learning to read the world. A year later, the place pulsed with kinetic life. Children tracing dots, parents in low conversations, volunteers arranging tactile books. Lydia stood at the head of a round table, palms steady, voice patient. She taught the alphabet with the lightness of someone who had been given permission to speak. "Feel that," she told a small girl whose hand trembled. "That is the letter B, 6 dots that make a sound your hands can sing." The little girl's face relaxed into astonishment, the miracle of being seen not with eyes but with touch. Applause came, not the polite clap of formality, but the warm sound of people recognizing transformation. Evan came by more often than policy required. He arrived without ceremony, a coffee in hand and a smile less guarded, his suit sleeves finally showing the fray of a man who spent more time doing than appearing. The plaque in the lobby, a polished bronze that read "Accessibility for All," in memory of Natalie Carter, caught the afternoon light. He watched Lydia move through the room with a pride that didn't require proclamation. When she caught his eye across the classroom, he nodded. There was no speech on this day, no executive floor announcement. Instead, there were small recognitions, a parent who hugged Lydia and whispered, "You changed my child's life," a board member who asked to support a scholarship, volunteers who offered their time. Lydia's new office was modest, a desk near a window that actually faced the river rather than a brick wall, but it held the plaque her mother had given her, raised dots that read, "I see you even when I can't." She pressed her thumbs to the wood sometimes, not out of need but as confirmation. Harper's public apology, posted informal, read like a lesson learned late. Lydia had never wanted punitive satisfaction. She had wanted truth and dignity. The apology felt like a stone dropped in a pond, ripples not vengeance. She forgave, not because Harper deserved it, but because forgiveness was a currency she could afford without forgetting. Evan walked her down the hallway after one program meeting, the building bathed in late sun that gave even the marble a warm edge. "You taught me a different way of seeing," he said, soft as the voice he used when no one was watching. Lydia smiled, a full, uncontained expression that found corners of her face she'd never used before. She had not expected to become anyone's hero. She had expected to make good on a promise she'd made to her mother, to use what she knew. The relationship between them was not a sudden romance with cinematic music and a kiss on a harbor pier. It was a gradual mutual attention, the sort that composes itself out of small acts, shared coffees, late brainstorming over curriculum, a hand sometimes offered across a desk at the precise moment the other's grip faltered. They were becoming companions in purpose, perhaps companions in life, though neither needed to define that immediately. Outside the center, a child who had been taught to read Braille earlier in the morning stopped and turned to the world as if seeing it for the first time. He reached to take his mother's hand and walked with confidence. Lydia followed them with her eyes, a quiet joy pooling in her chest. Evan stood beside her, his profile softened. "You see," he said, grateful and a little awed. "You were right. Kindness is a light that never leaves." She put her hand in his, the touch a small promise rather than a resolution. Around them, the room hummed with learning, the kind of ongoing work that turns grief into service and invisibility into voice. Lydia's story did not require a single tidy ending. It required a beginning that had waited a long time to be acknowledged. The plaque on her wall continued to read the same raised line every night, "I see you even when I can't." And now, for the first time, those words had an echo, not only in her small apartment, but in a building where doors opened, programs launched, and a city learned to notice what it had once overlooked. The camera pulls back slowly, a final composition of hands, faces, a community stitching itself together, and the last image is tactile, Lydia's fingers tracing a new Braille page, teaching another hand what it means to be seen. Fade out.